BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show, how's everybody doing? On Wednesdays this year I've been talking to you guys about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved mystery. And in this episode I will be responding to the book Jack the Ripper, In the Footsteps of the Notorious Serial Killer by Liam Dale. This is a book that surprised me a little because, from the title here, In the Footsteps of the Notorious Serial Killer, I thought that this was going to be a walkthrough of the crime scenes, maybe even something from a first-person narrative when he's talking about how Jack the Ripper would have committed the crimes, why Jack the Ripper would have committed the crimes, and what the killer was thinking. But instead, it does have some introductory elements about the crimes that were committed. Then it discusses the letters, and then it discusses some theories, and by his own admission, conspiracy theories, and the suspects in the Ripper case. Jack the Ripper was a serial killer who operated in England in 1888. Whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. And Jack the Ripper has also become the source material for numerous books as well as movies and TV shows. And one of them is Man in the Attic. And I would like to give a shout out to Ross Geraci, who will be doing an episode on Planet X Filmworks soon discussing the film Man in the Attic. It's one that I've seen before and talked to you guys about here on Ripper Wednesday, so I'm really looking forward to that one more time on Planet X Filmworks. And Man in the Attic is more or less a retelling of The Lodger, which was an early novel that was based on Jack the Ripper, and The Lodger was then turned into a film by Alfred Hitchcock. It was his third film. It's a silent film, but it's absolutely amazing, and I've discussed both of those films here on Ripper Wednesday. And if you want to follow along with all of these discussions about Jack the Ripper, you can hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. You can also go through some of the links in the description box. One of them is for buymeacoffee.com. Buymeacoffee.com/blackboxonlineradio allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And I want to remind you guys that this show is available for free downloads on Spotify and anywhere you get your podcasts, under the names Black Box True Crime and Black Box Podcast. So with the book, Jack the Ripper, In the Footsteps of the Notorious Serial Killer, it begins actually in early August, on August 7th of 1888, not with the canonical victims, but with the murder of Martha Tabram, the woman who was stabbed 39 times 3 weeks prior to the beginning of Jack the Ripper's true Autumn of Terror. But I think it's fair to say that Liam Dale is using this book to share his theories and observations about the Ripper case, and he believes that Martha Tabram was indeed killed by Jack the Ripper, which is a very widely held belief and something that is a very defendable case to make. But then there's the murder of Polly Nichols on August 31st of 1888. Then a lot of attention is paid to the murder of Annie Chapman in this book here, and Annie Chapman was murdered on September 8th of 1888. But there was one thing that I had not encountered before in my Jack the Ripper journey, and in this book by Liam Dale, he states that Annie Chapman famously wore 2 rings that were made of brass. And when her body was discovered, she was not wearing the brass rings, that someone had removed them after she was murdered, or at the very least, they were not present when her remains were found. And I just wanted to throw that out there. And also, though, there is a certain amount of attention that is paid to a possible witness named John Richardson, who was walking Hanbury Street, where Annie Chapman was, let's just say, in the vicinity of Annie Chapman's murder, at approximately 4:45 a.m. That is the time that's listed in the book. And even if you get on Annie Chapman's Wikipedia page, it will say shortly before 5 a.m. on September 8th of 1888, John Richardson entered the backyard of a property to check on a padlocked cellar. And this is even discussed in Liam Dale's book when he says that John Richardson was there because he wanted to check on his tool shed. And he states that John Richardson is actually the person who owned the leather apron that was worn by John Pizer. John Pizer is the famous Jack the Ripper suspect who was labeled as Leather Apron, but he's saying that this guy didn't even own the Leather Apron. It was owned by John Richardson. Now, as far as being a witness to the crime, 5 o'clock or 4:45 a.m. 4:45 a.m. I think would be impossible to have witnessed the killer in action. 4:45 a.m. I think is way too early for witnessing anything about the murder of Annie Chapman, because I did a book discussion once on Peter Foreman's Jack the Ripper, And he lays out a different timeline that I think is a little bit more accurate, and that is that at approximately 5:10 or 5:15 a.m., another witness named Albert Kadash wakes up, and then he puts on his boots and work clothes. He goes out into the yard in Hanbury Street, and he maybe hears something at some point that's a little bit suspicious, and then he goes back in the house, comes out again at around 5:28 a.m., somewhere between 5:28 and 5:32 a.m., and hears the sound of something being pushed against a fence. And we aren't 100% sure, but it's quite possible that that was Jack the Ripper attacking Annie Chapman, and he may have heard her say the word no. So, I mean, that would be a full 45 minutes after this, this incident where John Richardson is walking to check on his tool shed. So I just wanted to point that out, that I don't think that there would be any witness sighting of Jack the Ripper in action at 4:45 a.m. on September 8th of 1888. Moving on into the book, after the murder of Annie Chapman, we have the Dear Boss letter. And this is the stuff that I was talking to you guys about last week on Ripper Wednesday. I did an episode on the September 17th letter. So let's begin with that, actually. There is a Jack the Ripper letter that is dated September 17th, 1888. It was sealed in an envelope, and it wasn't discovered until 1988 in the archives, 100 years later, because of the anniversary. Let's just say that. It's discovered 100 years later in the archives in a sealed envelope, and some people believe that that's actually the first communication that was written by Jack the Ripper. Then we have the Dear Boss letter that was written on September 25th of 1888, and it was mailed and received on September 27th of 1888. And what's said about the letters here in this book by Liam Dale, Jack the Ripper in the Footsteps of the Notorious Serial Killer, is he is under the impression that all of the letters are hoaxes, but he says that they're unfortunate hoaxes because they wasted the time, effort, and energies of the Metropolitan Police. They wasted the time, effort, and energies of anybody who was looking into the Jack the Ripper case. And I am even someone who has made the statement that I don't think any of the letters are genuine, any of them are authentic, but these are the parts where I get challenged. And it relates to some things involving the timeline of the letters. Let's begin with September 17th, right? Okay, somebody even told me that they had this idea that the September 17th letter was authentic, and the Dear Boss letter, September 25th, 27th, was not authentic. And my response to that is logistically impossible. Practically, it's not impossible. What do I mean by that? Logistically impossible. If the September 17th letter was sealed and it wasn't opened until 100 years later, then how on earth could a hoaxer know the name Jack the Ripper? A hoaxer shouldn't have known the name Jack the Ripper prior to the opening of the September 17th letter. And when I said practically it's not impossible, that would just mean that, okay, somebody's like, yeah, I wrote a letter to the Central News Agency and I used the name Jack the Ripper. Then somebody was like, oh, well, did they open it? No, they didn't open it. Okay, so I'm going to write a hoax letter a week later. I don't really think that that's what happened, if I can be very honest. When I said logistically it's impossible, practically it's not impossible, but ultimately I don't think that that's what happened. I have to give a shout out to Black Box Online Radio listener Super Strike 9, who just said, I think the September 17th letter is a modern day forgery, and I ultimately stand there as well. But even though I'm someone who believes that the letters are hoaxes, I get heavily challenged with this stuff involving the timeline. The fact that the letter is mailed and received on September 27th of 1888, and then the next crimes occur on September 30th of 1888. This is 3 days later. And the only way that I think that I can reconcile this and act like this is a hoax that was created by either someone from the Central News Agency or maybe another newspaper such as the Star is that someone was talking to the police, someone was interacting with members of law enforcement, and they were making the statement that the killer has not been caught. So we think the killer is going to strike again. He has murdered at least 2 women, maybe 3 women, and we think that the killer is going to strike again. It's just a matter of time before the killer strikes again. So someone pens the Dear Boss letter on September 25th, mails it on September 27th, And then just by chance, the killer does indeed strike again on September 30th of 1888. And then there is another communication that is written on September 30th of 1888, and that is the Goulston Street Graffito. And there's been a lot of debate as to whether or not this one was written. Just to provide some basic introductory material, Liz Stride is murdered on September 30th of 1888 at approximately 12:58 a.m., and then the killer hides in the shadows and runs away to Mitre Square, then murders Catherine Eddowes. Her body is then mutilated, and her organs are even pulled out, and then the killer most likely wrote a message on a wall that is called the Goulston Street Graffito that says, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." In this book, In the Footsteps of the Notorious Serial Killer, Liam Dale more or less believes that that was indeed written by the killer. And then we would have actually a very odd moment in the book, because Liam Dale just goes on to say that the Ripper would write again, and he would write the From Hell letter and mail in half a portion of a kidney. And this is a little bit disappointing, because one of the things that I was really curious to hear about from him was that, what are his thoughts on the Saucy Jackie postcard? Because the September 17th letter, yeah, most likely that was a modern-day forgery, but with the Saucy Jackie postcard, well, what on earth is going on there? Because this is written roughly one day after the murders took place, and someone is taking credit for what they call a double event. Again, this timeline of the letters really does look like it could possibly and potentially be from the killer. I'm not 100% convinced that they are, but I've definitely had a lot of rethinking to do about the authenticity of the Dear Boss letter and the Saucy Jackie postcard. But okay, let's go to mid-October with the mailing of the From Hell letter. And Liam Dale had a very interesting take on that, because, as previously stated, the From Hell letter is mailed with a portion of a kidney. About half a kidney has been mailed to George Lusk, who was the chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. And one of the widely held beliefs about how and why somebody was able to mail a portion of a kidney if this letter were a hoax is, well, it was a medical student playing a prank who had access to them when they were performing anatomical dissections and so on from an anatomy class, medical classroom, and so on. But Liam Dale really didn't take a stance like that. Instead, he said that there's a high chance that there could have been someone who passed away in a workhouse and their body was taken to a mortuary, and that it was just stolen from the mortuary that way, and that it was just taken from some place like maybe even a morgue, or even someone who had just passed away in a very, very poor and unfortunate circumstance. And I've never quite heard anyone lay out some of the claims like that. But the reasons why he thought this were that the person who allegedly had the kidney that was mailed to George Lusk was suffering from alcoholism. The person was a heavy drinker, and there's even, some other claims that maybe this person had Bright's disease. And I can also just share some things about that for you. And that is that in one of the documentaries, I think it was a definitively ascertained fact, in that one they're saying that just Thomas Openshaw was the doctor that examined the kidney, one of the doctors that examined the kidney, and he made some comments to the press. And Dr. Openshaw's comments were heavily twisted by the press, and saying things like, oh yes, it was a female kidney who was age appropriate, and she had Bright's disease, and her renal artery matched up with the half kidney or the artery from Catherine Eddowes, and so on. And he's just like, as a follow-up, he's like, no, that is not what I meant to say at all. The only strong determination that they could make is that it was an adult human kidney. And I completely accept that they could not tell whether or not it was a male or female kidney because they didn't have DNA testing at the time, and that is also something that is widely accepted. So another point that is discussed heavily in the book, Jack the Ripper, In the Footsteps of the Notorious Serial Killer, is this was a sensational story for the newspapers. This was a sensational story for the press, because they're running wild with us, and they're saying a bunch of things, and not everything that they're saying and reporting on is true or factual. And I think maybe even a fair way to put it is, they're just messing around, according to Liam Dale, and by they, I mean members of the press, reporters, and the reason why they're doing this is because in 1888 there's a certain morbid curiosity that people had, and in this book he also tells the story of Joseph Merrick the Elephant Man. He's referring to him as John Merrick, as he was reported to have been called in the book by Frederick Treves, but Joseph Carey Merrick was his full name, and he talks about how he became famous because of being a sideshow attraction. And the reason why people had these fascinations with sideshows is macabre elements, curiosities about things that were not only different but also just very dark and morbid, and these things really captured people's attention, and they still do to this day. They're just done in different ways, and they're just shared in different ways. And we have things like TV and the media, and as well as podcasts and all types of electronic communication. But this was one of the ways that people would explore these types of dark and morbid subjects. So with a story such as Jack the Ripper, the media took this and they ran wild because the people wanted to hear it. But Jack the Ripper became a very strong and powerful story because, again, in Liam Dale's book, he talks about how Queen Victoria even wrote about Jack the Ripper in her journals. And this is the part where we get to the suspects. And he even states that there is a theory out there that Queen Victoria was Jack the Ripper. And yes, you can call this the Jill the Ripper theory. Anytime that the Whitechapel Fiend is referred to as a woman, you can call it the Jill the Ripper theory. But in all seriousness, I think that this is one of the most ridiculous suspects that I've ever heard. And I've always tried to say, if somebody has written a book, or they have a theory, or they have a set of articles, or they have a YouTube channel, and they put forward a theory about a true crime case, I'll talk about it. I'll discuss it. That one would really test my limits if you're going to say that Queen Victoria was Jack the Ripper. I mean, I might just kind of laugh a little bit and walk away, but maybe, let's see, if someone does create a book-length presentation on that, perhaps only in the name of fairness. And the royal conspiracies are discussed a lot in this book by Liam Dale. Another one that has received a little bit more attention is that it wasn't Queen Victoria, but it was the British royal surgeon named Sir William Gull, and he is discussed in 2 or 3 different theories in this book. Now, as a standalone suspect, meaning that William Gull was Jack the Ripper, and it was just William Gull, no assistants, no accomplices, this would be very unlikely, and this is what Liam Dale is sharing in his book. And that's because William Gull was in his 70s, and there was even a newspaper article that came out in 1887 talking about how he suffered from a seizure. The British royal surgeon suffered from a seizure. So you have an elderly man who is in poor health, and even if you're going to try and make the case that, well, the seizure caused him to start thinking abnormally, then you still have the problem of how he would not have been nimble and capable enough to perform these crimes purely by himself, let alone all the men that are either seen or witnessed around the women at the time are not reported to have been 70 years old. You hear witness descriptions like, yeah, maybe 30 years old, 36 years old, things of that nature, and also the psychological profiles that have been created by people such as John Douglas are also talking about someone late 20s, early 30s, not 70 years old. But William Gull gets incorporated into a different theory, and again, Liam Dale pays a lot of attention to the royal conspiracies here because he's also talking about Stephen Knight and the Final Solution. And, I mean, I guess there are 2 theories that are discussed when he's going through this one, that Jack the Ripper was a hoax that was created because of a problem with the royal family, and that is that Prince Albert Victor had an affair with a girl who was working in a shop, and he had a secret marriage to her, and she became pregnant, and a witness to that marriage was Mary Kelly, the final victim of Jack the Ripper. And Mary Kelly was murdered and mutilated as a way to silence her, and the reason why the other women were murdered was because they were part of Mary Kelly's inner circle, and they may have known the truth. Liz Stride would be an exception to that. Liz Stride was the 3rd victim of Jack the Ripper, and according to this analysis that's put forward by Liam Dale talking about Stephen Knight and the royal conspiracy, he states that Liz Stride would have been murdered because of a case of mistaken identity, and they realized very early on that they did not get the woman they were looking for. They were actually looking for Catherine Eddowes. That's why 2 women were murdered in one night. And it's all about silencing witnesses who would have known about this horrible, horrible scandal that would have destroyed the royal family. And there are three participants that are involved in this. There is William Gull, there is Walter Sickert, and there is the carriage driver. Walter Sickert had all the information, but the carriage driver would be the person who is actually handling the women, and William Gull would have mutilated them in the carriage, and then their bodies would have been taken from the carriage and placed on the ground. And while there is to talk about this in the book, in the footsteps of the notorious serial killer, there isn't a lot of criticism or pushback other than simply saying that a lot of people come up with wild stories. That's just Liam Dale's response to these things involving Sir William Gull. But in terms of the way that he lays out cases for other suspects, he looks at another one who is a little bit more widely discussed, and his name is Montague John Druitt. But I had a particular problem with his descriptions of Montague John Druitt, and that is that Mary Kelly, the final victim of Jack the Ripper, is murdered on November 9th of 1888. And then Liam Dale states that Montague John Druitt was thought to have gone insane and committed suicide shortly after the murder of Mary Kelly. And then that is one of the reasons why people think that he was Jack the Ripper. Now, this is a gross exaggeration because, as far as we know, Montague John Druitt kept working until the end of October 1888. Did I say October? I meant November. Mary Kelly's murdered November 9th. And Montague John Druitt is working at a school as well as being a barrister. He works until the end of November 1888, and he doesn't commit suicide, allegedly, or possibly, until the beginning of December 1888, so at the very least, 3 weeks have gone by since the murder of Mary Kelly, so there's an enormous amount of time gap, and also it's not just that he went insane, because he's interacting with people in his daily life and his working life, and this is one of the reasons why I think the story of Montague John Druitt is not only, not pointing toward him being Jack the Ripper. I also think that he has been unfairly vilified in the history books for being a widely discussed Jack the Ripper suspect, or as some people think of him, as a very highly probable Jack the Ripper suspect. I don't see any of that at all with Montague John Druitt, and I think he's been unfairly labeled in all of this. But I told you guys on this episode of Ripper Wednesday that I really wanted to talk about the letters, and I've gone through some of them: the September 17th letter, the Dear Boss letter, the Saucy Jackie postcard, and the From Hell letter. But there is a letter that is not mentioned in the book by Liam Dale that I would like to discuss with you anyway, and this is the McCarthy Letter. Perhaps I'm going to have to do a larger presentation on this. Perhaps the loudest proponent of the McCarthy Letter being authentic is Randy Williams, who is the author of Sherlock Holmes and the Autumn of Terror, and there is a post about John McCarthy written on casebook.org, which I would like to read for you now. John McCarthy was the landlord of 26 Dorset Street, the address where Mary Kelly lived. The address is frequently referred to as 13 Miller's Court, though it is in fact one and the same. McCarthy has come under suspicion for reasons unknown. He allowed Mary Kelly to fall behind on her rent to the tune of 29s. I'm not even going to speculate on that. I could give a few guesses, but on the morning of November 9th, 1888, shortly before 10:30 a.m., John McCarthy set his assistant, Thomas Boyer, to collect what rent he could from Mary Kelly. Boyer knocked on the door of Mary Kelly's room but received no reply. He then tried the door but found that it was locked. He therefore reached inside the broken window pane, pulled back the dirty muslin curtain to be confronted by the mutilated body of Mary Kelly. A shocked Boyer rushed back to McCarthy to report, "Governor, I knocked at the door, but I could not make anyone answer. I looked through the window and I saw a lot of blood." McCarthy and Boyer then rushed to Kelly's room and peered through the window. McCarthy would recall, "The sight we saw I cannot drive away from my mind. It looked like the work of a devil rather than a man. I heard a great deal about the Whitechapel murders, but I declare to God that I have never expected to see such a sight as this. The whole scene is more than I can describe. I hope I may never see such a sight again." McCarthy then sent Boyer to the police station, and after tending this to his shop, later followed him. Aberline, that's Inspector Aberline, was informed by Inspector Beck that bloodhounds had been sent for Dr. Phillips and advised against forcing the door until the dogs had arrived. At 1:30 a.m., Inspector Arnold arrived, and then with the news, and in fact, on the way, The door was forced open. McCarthy, armed with a pickaxe, forced the door open himself. It has been asked exactly why McCarthy was using a pickaxe to open the door when, as the landlord, he surely must have possessed a spare key. Also, why did he choose that morning to send his assistant to collect the rent? Theorists have suggested that McCarthy was a regular client of Kelly's. Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking, but didn't want to say it. And this could offer the explanation about why she was allowed to accumulate her rent without paying it, and possibly offers an explanation to the reason why she was murdered. Well, now that's a very big thing there. You could just say this woman, Mary Kelly, whose occupation we all know was falling behind on her rent, so she found a way to get out of paying her rent. Okay, alright, I mean, that's not going to shock anything, but that's an enormous jump to say that this is why she was murdered. I mean, I just see insufficient evidence there to state that that's a motive for her murder. That's just a question mark to me rather than any type of direction. So, another theory is that McCarthy may have been related to Kelly and may have, in fact, been an uncle or distant cousin. McCarthy was born in France in 1851. He was married with 4 children, and he let out many rooms, locally known as McCarthy's Rents, and was reported to have lost a number of tenants following the murder. According to the East London Observer, McCarthy rejected a morbid offer to buy or hire Mary Kelly's bedroom, possibly due to the attention that was received after the murder. But McCarthy and his wife received a letter that was signed Jack the Ripper, a postcard that was dated November 11th. That would be 2 days after the murder, and it was postmarked Folkestone, in which the sender threatened, next time a woman and her daughter. John McCarthy died in 1935. So you see, the McCarthy letter is going to contain a very small piece of text. But this is more or less a postcard that doesn't have any of the elaborations of Jack the Ripper's other crimes. Threatened next a woman and her daughter. But it really surprised that there aren't more discussions about the McCarthy letter online, or there are other elements to this. And one of the reasons why Randy Williams thinks that this is an authentic communication from Jack the Ripper is there are some drawings at the bottom of the McCarthy letter which he believes are the incorporations of certain suspects. His suspects in the case, Louis Deemschutz, Isaac Kozabrodsky, and Samuel Friedman, have their names in these drawings that are down there, and that video is online as well as one that is on his Facebook page. But as far as this McCarthy letter, it's actually mailed to McCarthy's wife, and then it's addressed to him. So that's why it's called the McCarthy letter as opposed to the John McCarthy letter. I should have rephrased that. It's addressed to her and mailed to her, but it's obviously directed for him. So that's why it's just the McCarthy letter as opposed to the John McCarthy letter. Now this is going to tie into some other things that are discussed in Liam Dale's book. And as I said, he doesn't mention the McCarthy letter, but we are looking at suspects and reasons as to how and why Jack the Ripper would have committed the crimes. Should John McCarthy be a suspect? I mean, I'm really not seeing a lot of things that would indicate that he has done anything other than possibly mess around with Mary Kelly and try to get some favors from her. Now, I also do not see that as a reason to have her murdered. I mean, if anything, he's the landlord. He would have had power over her in different ways. You would probably need something much larger than that to commit a murder of that level and of that magnitude. Liam Dale even talks about this very clearly in the book, and he states that the murder of Mary Kelly is one that you can look at online. You can see the crime scene photos online, and the first time that we see those, you'll probably have a similar experience to what John McCarthy just stated, that it's a bloody sight that you will never forget. And there's one point that I forgot to mention, so I'll say it right now in regards to the suspects. And that is that in the book by Liam Dale, he talks about how there's a suspect named George Chapman that appears to be highly considered by Inspector Frederick George Aberline. And George Chapman is apparently even widely discussed by Philip Sugden, who wrote the complete history of Jack the Ripper. And I'm going to be very honest with you guys. I think that George Chapman is a ridiculous suspect, or at the very least he is a low-level suspect, for the following reason. George Chapman's real name was Severin Klasovsky, and I have a standalone episode about him, but he was a real serial killer called the Burrow Poisoner, and I would just think that it's such an impractical way for a serial killer to get less violent, less complicated, less complex, less physical, and less intense after the murder of Mary Kelly, perhaps the most brutal murder ever seen. Then he's going to switch to poisoning as his MO. I don't necessarily think so. I know they have a lot of things about his movements. I know that he married a woman named Annie Chapman, the same name as one of the victims, but I just think in terms of profiling, psychopathology, behaviors, and I just don't think Jack the Ripper would have evolved into a poisoner or devolved into a poisoner. I think, if anything, he either stopped killing or he would have committed other grisly murders. But as a final note, I do give credit to Liam Dale for his book when he states that there are murders that happen after the murder of Mary Kelly, and there are murders that happen, what he says, regularly in Whitechapel at regular intervals. One of them, again, if you're going to mean the murder of Rose Milett that occurs on December 20th of 1888, I wouldn't even call that a regular interval. That's, let's see, December 20th, that's like 8 or 9, 7 to 8, 9 weeks after the murder of Mary Kelly. That is a very long time frame, longer than any of the gaps in Ripper activity, so I wouldn't call it regular activity for Jack the Ripper, but yes, there are murders that happened after the murder of Mary Kelly, and let's just say one more giant rest in peace to the victims. And also, I do recommend this book, even though I've been critical of some parts of it, and there are things in this book that I have wanted to challenge and wanted to discuss, and also challenging some of the reasons why he would put things forward, like the 445 incident involving John Richardson walking down the street and checking on his tool shed. I don't doubt that that happened, to be very clear. I do accept that that happened. I just don't think that he could have seen the Ripper committing any murders, and so on. And what do you think about his claim that he believes that the From Hell letter was a hoax and the kidney was taken from someone who died in a workhouse and it was taken from the mortuary? What do you think about that? I mean, I've never heard anyone lay it out exactly like that before. What do you think about his observations involving the royal conspiracy that he more or less just dismisses? Do you have any comments on that? And also, do you have anything to say about this story involving John McCarthy? Maybe I'll have to do a whole independent standalone episode on him as a suspect, and I just wanted to put all of this stuff out there. And one more time, you can hit the like button and subscribe if you want. You can also follow the show on Facebook. I have a page over there for Black Box Online Radio. You can get the show on Instagram, BlackBoxNid88, BlackBoxNid88 on TikTok as well. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. That's really good if you want to send me larger things like attachments. And that will be all for me now. Until next time.